For the Torah portion, I started off with a review of 5 Hebrew words. I was a little nervous about doing that because I thought, that's a lot of Hebrew, right? And it's been a while since we've even had our Hebrew class going. In fact, not this year at all. And since the Torah portions, we're reaching that halfway mark, aren't we, through the Torah portion? So I was a little bit nervous about that, but then I thought, I'm going to do it because it helps to lay a good foundation for a study of Metzora. And so this Torah portion is, again, a short portion. Often it's part of a double portion for Torah. It often is. But at the way timing is this year and going into Pesach and to Passover, we have these 2 separate Torah portion readings. But they are very much connected, and we discussed a little bit about that last week. So I want to quickly review, before we read the Torah portion, these Hebrew words once again. Kind of refreshing your mind, and it'll be good for those that didn't have an opportunity to hear that. So I have 5 words related to the Torah portion last week and this week concerning Metzora primarily. That of being a leper. And a leper is someone who has sara'at. And it's very difficult to translate that accurately. And I'll just make a blanket statement here. All English translations have gotten it wrong. That's not primarily the fault of the English translators, because the Jewish translators of the Septuagint, what Christians know of the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew that was in existence in Alexandria, Egypt, for hundreds of years before Yeshua. So, it was dispersed throughout the diaspora. So, it was dispersed throughout the dispersion of Jews, throughout certainly the Roman Empire as well. Because Greek was the language of government. It was the language of commerce at that time. Even the Romans, when they came in and were just conquering left and right and taking over nations and bringing them into the Roman Empire, they built that empire on the back of what Alexander the Great had done. The great Greek conqueror who just went through the ancient world, even as a young man, very quickly conquered so many nations. And so he built that on that. And in that process, he had already spread Greek throughout the same areas. There we go. They're the same areas that the Jews were dispersed to. So, their choice of a word was the lepers. And consequently, they chose that word because it was the closest Greek word that identified what sara'at was, what it was to be a Metzora. Consequently, that came in through the Greek, Latin, and English, and became the English translation. In fact, very few, even today, very few Christians have much of a grasp of biblical Hebrew. There are many Jews that don't have a grasp of biblical Hebrew, even though they speak Hebrew, because modern Hebrew is not like biblical Hebrew. It truly is a modern language. Right? It uses the same letters, characters, sounds for the most part. So when we dig a little deeper, and that's what this was an attempt to do, to look at the biblical Hebrew, we find something that's quite amazing. Because many have thought, because of the Greek translation of the Hebrew, that leprosy was the same thing as Hansen's disease, the nerve disease, the scientific medical term for leprosy, in which a person's nerves do not function properly, so that they are always injuring themselves and they don't know it. So even minor injuries can become deadly because they can become infected because you feel no pain. And some people say, wow, that's great. You feel no pain. Pain, much as it pains me to say this, is a great blessing. Now we know we keep rushing for pain relief, painkillers. So there's a level where the pain tolerance is exceeded. But the pain itself helps to define who we are and what our limitations are, so we do not hurt ourselves and overextend ourselves. But without that function, then everything goes awry. That has nothing to do with biblical leprosy. Nothing. It has nothing to do with Sarah Rut. Because what we have with Sarah Art, and what was exhibited by even Moses at the burning bush is protesting. He's backing away. No. He doesn't want to be the spokesman to deliver the children of Israel. That God has selected him, and there's no turning back. And all his objections are met. And at one point, he is told to put his hand into his tunic and bring it out again. And it's sara'at. It's leprous. It's white. And then he's told to put it back in, and he brings it out again, and it's whole. So that was a sign. Because what sara'at is a sign of death. A sign of death. So those who have sara'at in the Bible are truly the walking dead. And they are even isolated from everybody, just like a dead person would be. They have to live outside the camp. They cannot associate with anyone. They are ostracized. They have to cover their upper lip and shout, unclean, unclean, whenever they're in the presence of other people. Sara'at is a physical manifestation of a spiritual condition. We don't have many terms that deal with that in the medical profession. You might talk to some psychiatrists or psychologists, and they probably might have some connections that could be made in that regard. So it's not primarily a medical condition. And even the priests are not treating those with the Metzora. They are yes, prescribing what Scripture says, but they are examining. And once the examination is made, it's pretty clear what the steps are. And they would go through the process of someone who was unclean, that was tamei, unclean. And then they become clean. There's a process for restoring them to life, to restoring them to the community. And they would follow those procedures. And we're going to look at some of that today and see, wow, that seems kind of strange. And a lot of these things do seem strange to us. But it will help us if we can get out of our mind the idea that leprosy, as taught in Scripture, is not primarily a medical disease, a medical condition. It is a spiritual condition. It is a physical manifestation of a spiritual condition. Okay. So, this is the word sara'at. Sara'at, that's leprosy. Someone that has sara'at is called a Metzora. And that's the title of our Torah portion today, for this week. So we have tamei, unclean, tahor, and clean. Now, what does it mean to be clean and unclean? Well, it's difficult. See, that word also is not properly translated. It's somewhat close, but it doesn't capture it. And Christians in particular have a really difficult time with clean and unclean. Because their things have become so spiritualized within Christian theology that it's difficult to make a connection when we say, well, it's unclean is actually better translated as ritually unclean, ritually poor. Well, that word doesn't accomplish much either, especially for evangelical backgrounds, because they repudiate ritual. They substitute their own, however the Spirit moves me, for the liturgy, for the ritual that they see in what's called high church, like Catholicism or the Lutheran church. They see that's kind of like high church in their mind. But that is based on tradition as well that has diverged greatly from what we're talking about with the ancient biblical Hebrew scriptures. Okay? So what does it really mean? So this idea of ritually clean or ritually unclean, ritually pure, ritually impure, is the idea that if you are unclean, it's not primarily because of your spiritual condition. It's not primarily associated with the sinful or sinlessness of your heart. It is a physical purity or impurity. And if you are unclean, physically unclean, and there's a whole list of things that would make someone unclean, that means that you, no matter how much your heart loves God and is devoted to God, you cannot go into His presence. You cannot bring a sacrifice to the tabernacle, to the temple. So, because you are unclean. Now, We'll expand on it just a little bit before we go on. Why? You know, why is a good question? Why is a great question? I often ask why, and by asking why, we often get information that we can use and understand, but not always. But sometimes when God says something or commands something and we don't know why, let's just obey him. And maybe in this life, maybe not, we will come to some point where we do understand why. There's something more important than knowing why, and that's obedience. Obedience. So the first why is to be obedient. That's the first one. All right. Now, we're not, of course, satisfied with that. It goes all the way back to the garden. Right? Knowledge of good and evil. To be like God. Goes back to that. So we want to know why. And a lot of people will absolutely refuse if they don't have it, because they're going to judge the why. They're going to judge God. Well, that's not a good enough reason for me to obey. What sense is that? Maybe it's better that you not ask why if you come up with a why that you disagree with. And that's going to inhibit your obedience to God. Right? So, why is not all it's cut out to be. And I can guarantee you there will always be a why. Just like a little child that loves to use that word of power to ask why. And you give him an answer, and he asks why. And why. And wear you out with whys. Right? Wear you out. Okay. So. All right. So I'll give you a why. Because of the fall. Because of sin. We are struggling within two kingdoms. God said, the day that you eat of that fruit, of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, you will surely die. And we run after that tree. We run after that fruit. And not just Eve. We go for it. Okay. And it's epitomized by the idea of why. Okay. Asking why. Right? So, there's two kingdoms. There's the kingdom of life and the kingdom of death. And God is calling us to life. He says, choose life. But the world, under the powers of the darkness, the prince of the power of the airs, is the kingdom of death. So, whatever touches that kingdom of death is going to be impure. We're not going to be able to come into the kingdom of life until it's been cleansed, until it's been made pure. So you can see already, sara'at, which is living death, which is basically our condition. That's basically the human condition. We're living dead people. Because death holds over us. It holds sway within the world. Look at it, right? And look, even in our culture, you see the signs of that. There's a worship of death. Do we prize our offspring, our progeny, like we see in biblical Hebrew? There were so many women who were barren. It was like the very worst thing that could ever happen to a woman, to be barren. That's Scripture's teaching. And what do we have today? We have a culture that will do away with life if it's inconvenient, if it's in the way. That life is a hardship. That life is going to make my life harder. I don't need that right now. I've got these dreams. I've got these plans. So, abortion is a legal right in our nation. And in fact, it's stronger than almost every other nation in the world. We rank right up there with China herself. Most countries put restrictions on abortion, but abortion is there. And it is a good example of the culture of death. The worship's death. One more point. There is a fascination with zombies. Everywhere you look. I mean, the zombie craze is huge. And what are zombies? Let's see. The classic film is called Night of the Living Dead. Yeah, that was actually filmed in my own backyard in southwestern Pennsylvania. Not literally, but within a few miles. All right. So, wow. And look at that. And you see it so much. And that is also, now, we know who's behind all of that. We know who has a grip on those that are bringing culture under the sway of his dominion, his deadly dominion. All right? So that's the struggle that we're dealing with. Now, the last word I have down here is korban, which is sacrifices. And the idea also in Christian mindset is that sacrifice primarily is something that you give up. And in Hebrew, that's not it at all. Yes, you do give up something. You're giving the best of your field. But that's not the focus. That's not the focus. The focus is you bring the offering. You bring the sacrifice in order to draw near to God. So it is to celebrate the nearness, to celebrate the presence of God, to actually draw near to God. And that is the root of Korban. That's what it means. Okay. All right. So let's go on. Let's with our reading today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, melech haolam, asher kideshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzavanu la'asok b'devrei Torah. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with commandments and commanded us to study words of Torah. Let's begin with Vayikra chapter 14, Leviticus 14. Adonai said to Moshe, "This is to be the law concerning the person afflicted with sara'at on the day of his purification. He is to be brought to the Kohen, and the Kohen is to go outside the camp and examine him there. If he sees that the sara'at sores have been healed in the afflicted person, then the Kohen will order that 2 living, clean, tahor, 2 living, clean birds be taken for the one to be purified, along with cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop leaves. The Kohen is to order one of the birds slaughtered in a clay pot over running water. As for the live bird, he is to take it with the cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, and dip them and the living bird in the blood of the bird slaughtered over the running water, and sprinkle the person to be purified from the sara'at 7 times. Next, he is to set the live bird free in an open field. He who is to be purified must wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and bathe himself in water. Then he will be clean. And after that he may enter the camp. But he must live outside his tent for 7 days. On the 7th day, he is to shave all the hair off his head, also his beard and eyebrows. He must shave off all his hair, and he is to wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and he will be clean. On the 8th day, he is to take 2 male lambs without defect, 1 female lamb in its first year without defect, and 6.5 quarts of fine flour for a grain offering mixed with olive oil, and 2/3 of a pint of olive oil. The Kohen, purifying him, is to place the person being purified with these items before Adonai at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The Kohen is to take 1 of the male lambs and offer it as a guilt offering with the 2/3 pint of olive oil. Then wave them as a wave offering before Adonai. He is to slaughter the male lamb at the place in the sanctuary for slaughtering sin offerings and burnt offerings, because the guilt offering belongs to the Kohen, just like the sin offering. It is especially holy. The Kohen is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Next, the Kohen is to take some of the 2/3 pint of olive oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand. Dip his right finger in the oil that is in his left hand and sprinkle the oil with his finger 7 times before Adonai. Then the Kohen is to put some of the remaining oil in his hand on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of the right hand, on the big toe of his right foot, and on the blood of the guilt offering. Finally, the Kohen is to put the rest of the oil in his hand on the head of the person being purified. And the Kohen will make atonement for him before Adonai. The Kohen is to offer the sin offering and make atonement for the person being purified because of his uncleanness. Afterwards, he is to slaughter the burnt offering. The Kohen is to offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. Thus the Kohen will make atonement for him, and he will be clean. If he is poor, so that he can't afford to do otherwise, he is to take 1 male lamb as a guilt offering to be waved to make atonement for him, 2 quarts of fine flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, 2/3 of a pint of olive oil, and 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, such as he can afford, the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. On the 8th day, he will bring them to the Kohen for his purification to the entrance of the tent of meeting before Adonai. The Kohen is to take the lamb of the guilt offering and the 2/3 of a pint of olive oil and wave them as a wave offering before Adonai. He is to slaughter the lamb of the guilt offering, and the Kohen is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. The Kohen is to take some of the olive oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand and sprinkle with his right hand some of the oil that is in his left hand 7 times before Adonai. The Kohen is to put some of the oil in his right hand on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of the right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, in the same place as the blood of the guilt offering. Finally, the Kohen is to put the rest of the oil in his hand on the head of the person being purified to make atonement for him before Adonai. He is to offer one of the doves or young pigeons, such as the person can afford, whatever his means suffice for, the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, with the grain offering. Thus the Kohen will make atonement before Adonai for the person being purified. Such is the law for the person who has sara'at sores, if he cannot afford the usual elements used for his purification. Adonai said to Moshe and Aaron, when you have entered the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as a possession, and I put an infection of sara'at in a house in the land that you possess, then the owner of the house is to come and tell the Kohen, it seems that there may be an infection in the house. The Kohen is to order the house emptied before he goes to inspect the infection, so that everything in the house won't be made unclean. Afterwards, the Kohen is to enter and inspect the house. He will examine the infection, and if he sees that the infection is in the walls of the house with greenish or reddish depressions that seem to go in deeper than the surface of the wall, he is to go out of the house to its door and seal up the house for 7 days. The Kohen will come again on the 7th day and examine the house. If he sees that the infection has spread over the walls, he is to order them to remove the infected stones and throw them into some unclean place outside the city. Next, he is to have the inside of the house thoroughly scraped, and the scraped off plaster is to be discarded outside the city in an unclean place. Finally, other stones must be set in the place of the first stones, and other plaster used to replaster the house. If the infection returns and breaks out in the house after the stones have been removed and the house scraped and plastered, then the Kohen is to enter and examine it. If he sees that the infection has spread in the house, it is a contagious sara'at in the house. It is unclean. He must break down the house and take its stones, timber, and plaster out of the city to an unclean place. Moreover, Whoever enters the house at any time while it is sealed up will be unclean until evening. Whoever lies down or eats in the house must wash his clothes. If the Kohen enters, examines, and sees that the infection has not spread in the house since it was plastered, then he is to declare the house clean because the infection is cured. To purify the house, he is to take 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop leaves. He is to slaughter one of the birds in a clay pot over running water. He is to take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet yarn, and the live bird and dip them in the blood of the slaughtered bird and in the running water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. He will purify the house with the blood of the bird, the running water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. But he is to set the live bird free outside the city in an open field. Thus will he make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. Such is the law for all kinds of sara'at sores, for a crusted area, for sara'at in a garment, for a house, for a swelling, for a scab, and for a bright spot, to determine when it is clean and when it is unclean. This is the law concerning sara'at. Chapter 15. Adonai said to Moshe and Aaron, tell the people of Israel, when any man has a discharge from his body, the discharge is unclean. The discharge is unclean no matter whether it continues flowing or has stopped. It is still his uncleanness. Every bed which the person with the discharge lies on is unclean, and everything he sits on is unclean. Whoever touches his bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Whoever sits on anything the person with the discharge sat on is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches the body of the person with the discharge is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, the latter is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Any saddle that the person with the discharge rides on will be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him will be unclean until evening. He who carries those things is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with the discharge fails to rinse his hands in water before touching someone, that person is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with the discharge touches a clay pot, it must be broken. If he touches a wooden utensil, it must be rinsed in water. When a person with a discharge has become free of it, he is to count 7 days for his purification. Then he is to wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water. After that, he will be clean. On the 8th day, he is to take for himself 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, come before Adonai to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and give them to the Kohen. The Kohen is to offer them, the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. Thus, the Kohen will make atonement for him on account of his discharge before Adonai. If a man has a seminal emission, he is to bathe his entire body in water. He will be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather on which there is any semen is to be washed with water. It will be unclean until evening. If a man goes to bed with a woman and has sexual relations, both are to bathe themselves in water. They will be unclean until evening. If a woman has a discharge, and the discharge from her body is blood, she will be in her state of nidah for 7 days. Whoever touches her will be unclean until evening. Everything she lies on or sits on in her state of nidah will be unclean. Whoever touches her bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Whoever touches anything she sits on is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. As soon as he touches the bed or something she sat on, he will be unclean until evening. If a man goes to bed with her and her menstrual flow touches him, he will be unclean 7 days. And every bed he lies on will be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not during her period, or if her discharge lasts beyond the normal end of her period, then throughout the time she is having an unclean discharge, she will be as when she is nidah. She is unclean. Every bed she lies on at any time while she's having her discharge will be for her like the bed she uses during her time of nidah. And everything she sits on will be unclean, with uncleanness like that of her time of nidah. Whoever touches those things will be unclean. He is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If she has become free of her discharge, she is to count 7 days. After that, she will be clean. On the 8th day, she is to take for herself 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the Kohen at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The Kohen is to offer the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. Thus the Kohen will make atonement for her before Adonai on account of her unclean discharge. In this way, you will separate the people of Yisrael from their uncleanness, so that they will not die in a state of uncleanness for defiling my tabernacle, which is there with them. Such is the law for the person who has a discharge, for the man who has a seminal emission that makes him unclean, for the woman in nidah during her menstrual period, for the person, man or woman, with a discharge, and for the man who has sexual relations with a woman who is unclean. What questions do you have? Yes.
When they were being cleansed or part of the process, it was a part where it talked about putting the blood on the ear, the big toe, the thumb of the right hand. I was just wondering, is there any significance of those specific body parts?
Absolutely. Tremendous significance. Okay, next question.
If so, what?
No. Yeah, I don't know what the significance is, but I do know that there's tremendous significance. Yes, so let's find out. Here.
Aaron's and the priests had done the same thing, did they not?
No, it was with oil.
They used oil.
They used oil, so
But
like.
it's still some.
Blood, yeah, and oil, blood and oil. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, they when the priests were anointed, they would do they didn't say hand, they said the earlobe, the thumb, and the toe. So there's similarity, but not exactly the same, you know what I mean? But
Well, that's true, and that was part of the purification process for the priest, for the high priest and all that, when they dedicated the tabernacle. And also, there is also it doesn't specifically state that there is anointing like they did for the high priest, but
that was the high priest, and I'm just stating.
the high priest, right.
I'm not saying that.
But even here we see where some of the oil is put on the head of the person after they've gone through the purification process. Mike, did you want to answer her question? Kevin.
Has been pretty much separated from the community. And so being restored back into that community, what God shows through these similarities is, the high priest has to go through a very similar process to come before, to go into the tabernacle and do his service. And so what God is showing there, that this person who has been excommunicated from the community and hasn't had the opportunity of any physical touch for many all the time he's been in this uncleanness, that hey, I'm accepting you back in as I would the high priest to come before me. So it's kind of dispelling this idea that in his kingdom there's no caste system, and that I'm restoring you back into the community. And so it's a psychological thing too. Like with the doves, one dies, one gets released. So psychologically that helps an individual be able to, get back to a normal life, knowing that, hey, God has accepted, my offerings and this cleansing process, and I'm accepted back in the community. One of the things that Yeshua did when, the lepers, when he healed the lepers, did you know that the healing of a leper was one of the signs of the Messiah?
Yes.
And so that was a huge thing, when Yeshua came as one of his signs, how he and he told the people that he healed the leprosy, now go. Well, first he says, go tell no man. But then he also tells them to go to the temple and offer, your offerings, okay? Because then that would be the sign to the priest, because this hasn't happened in Israel before. And it's like these men come to be cleansed, because they've been healed of leprosy. It's like right there's a sign that the Messiah is here. And but one of the things that Yeshua did is he reached out and he touched a leper. So what does that tell us? That tells us that, a man who hasn't, or a person who hasn't been able to accept any touch, some of these were plagued with leprosy for years, if not decades. And, being outside the community and to be touched for the first time in their leprosy, what does that tell us? That tells us that, we have a king that wants to restore us back to the Garden of Eden, like it was in the beginning. And so that had to be a really psychological healing process for a leper that was touched, by the king. And now because he was touched, Yeshua touched the leper, what did that make Yeshua? Ritually unclean, not morally. So what did he have to do before he could go back into the temple? He had to offer the offerings that went along with being cleansed from touching something unclean, okay? So just a few interesting points of the psychological, things that occur with the things that God instituted from the beginning. You know, it's all about restoring us back to that garden, and we often need that psychological affirmation, and a lot of these rituals provided that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Was that helpful? That was helpful? Okay, let's go with Marcel.
Who's next? We had
Oh.
hands up.
Oh, yeah, you have a comment, right, Kevin? Okay.
Like I said, it was fine. I said it was fine. My question was about verse 15:26. In my translation, the word is separation, but it was Strong's 5079. I was kind of wrestling with it over here. That's why I said it was fine. But for Nida, what my question originally was that it can be a personal or moral filthiness. And it was something that women, naturally exist within. So I was curious as to why it could implicate both, because something else in parentheses is that it can also refer to like idolatry and incest, which is something that you choose, not something that happens to you. So just wrestling with that understanding.
Okay, and
thank you.
what was the question?
What?
Is there a question?
Oh, just wondering why it can mean both moral and a personal.
Oh, moral and personal, the uncleanness or the cleansing part?
Yeah, because of that separation that happens, like one is a
Well,
choice and one
yeah,
is
I don't
something that
pretend
happens.
to know all the why, certainly.
Yeah,
But part of this is, what is this all about, is part of that is the blood that's involved. Because the life is in the blood. And also, this is potential life that is not, and will not be. I think that is also part of the connection too with the seminal emission as well. So there was potential life here that will not be. And in a sense, that's not a death because there was no life there, but it acknowledges that blood is going to die. That blood is not life-changing, life-giving anymore.
Okay.
It was the potential that was there. And also there is a practice which I can't really speak on with very much authority because I've never really experienced a mitzvah. But many Jewish women, after their period, will have a mikvah, which mikvah is the Hebrew word that baptism is based upon. Okay? And so there's a place, a mikvah, a bath, a ritual washing that takes place. And that is preparation for her bridegroom because she is now clean. Right? And so that's part of what the mikvah, part of what goes on with the mikvah. Yeah. Kevin. We're going to have to wrap up here, so you can probably get the last
Real quickly,
word.
wanted to add two. I always want to. So the why. I like to expound on the why. As a father, I always enjoyed those moments where my children came up to me and said why. And so I want to encourage that it's a good thing to say why, but comes a point in a time as a father, then you say, because I said so.
Why is this
And
night so different from all other nights? That's right. So we're going to have lots of whys when Pesach
So
comes
whys
around,
are
when
good.
Passover. So,
However, there comes a
thank you
point
for
in
making
time-
that affirmation. And, yeah.
And
You are
the
such a
father
loving, patient
determines-
father.
Yeah,
Thank
the
you.
father determines when, that, anyway. And the other thing was, I'd like it to further the conversation, how the cleansing of the leper is our salvation in Messiah, and how it connects a lot of things, not only the priests, but the sea of reeds and many other things. The whole cleansing process involved that, and it's similar to us in Messiah and the cleansing process we go through.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to close. I just want to make one closing comment. Please read the Haftorah portion today from 2 Kings, because there are lepers there in that story. And one of the things that is that what is Savara'at? What's it all about? Well, it's about, a lot of it is focused on broken relationships through your words. Miriam and Aaron is example of Savara'at that she experienced because she said evil words about Moses. Right? In 2 Kings, we have a type of redemption of lepers, where they realize that they have an opportunity to speak good news, to the city, and that in a sense will show that they are no longer those who speak evil words, who speak bad words, because they're going to bring good news to the city. Have a look at that. It's pretty powerful. Okay?
Is it on? Yeah, it's on. Now, I've studied this for about 20 minutes now, but so.
I'm sorry, I missed you.
But I have to put leprosy into context, I think, because let's face it, as we read that section of Leviticus and how massive it is and how much detail goes into this condition, there's obviously more to the story. This isn't just about, herpes simplex 2 or something. This is a much bigger theme. I think you can put it into context as potentially the first place that's ever mentioned. First mention is at the burning bush. This is the first place leprosy appears. And it's completely out of place there too. As I see it, suddenly, when we're talking about dispensing the curses upon Egypt, leprosy is introduced, but leprosy doesn't become a part of the plague of Egypt. It has something to do with Moses. He experiences it, and then he's cured of it, and we don't hear about it again until Leviticus. So it's very strange.
Miriam and Aaron.
Okay, is the next mention?
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Next mention.
All right, right.
Is Leviticus. Or at least as I looked it up.
Go ahead and finish it, and then I'll make another closing comment, and you can go whenever you want to, because they're going to.
Okay, that's it.
Okay. You're done? Oh, okay. All right. There is some context for Moses' Sara'at, because he was saying some bad words to God. He didn't want to take the good news of deliverance to his people. Find someone else. And so that is context, right? And that goes. That's some context. I'm just putting that. I'm glad you said that, because that particular context goes really well with the 2 Kings Haftorah, right? So we got to think in terms maybe of the counterpoint to saying bad words is to say good words. Instead of talking bad about people, to give good news instead of bad news, right? Okay, so thank you for your attention. Shabbat Shalom.